Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon muser this evening. So tonight, I am going to be doing a review of DC Adventures, the Hero's Handbook. This is the core book for the DC Adventures role-playing game line that was published by Green Ronin from 2010 until 2013. This game also, as I understand it, the contents of this book are effectively what's in the Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition role-playing game, Hero's Handbook as well, just with the references to DC intellectual property stripped out. So I haven't labeled this video as such because I have not compared the two different games, so I don't know that for certain, but that's my understanding. So whatever I have to say about the Hero's Handbook here, you can take to likely apply to the Mutants and Masterminds Heroes Handbook as well, apart from where I've got references to DC Adventures. So as with all my videos, to give you a context of, or my reviews at least, to give you a context of how this will be structured, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the game. I'm going to talk about what the game's about. I'm going to talk about the core mechanics and describe how those function. I'm going to talk about what you play in the game, what characters and whatnot and heroes that you create to be able to play in that game, what you'll do in the game as a player. I'm going to talk about what's actually in the book, and then I'm going to give my thoughts on who this game might be for. So let's start with the background. So DC Adventures is a bit of a child of two different parents. One of those parents is the Mutants and Masterminds game. That's the system that drives this. Mutants and Masterminds was the version, it's a D20 based role-playing game that was published by Green Ronin in 2 previous editions before this book came out. That were, both editions were written by Steve Pramis, is that his name? No, Steve Kenson. Yeah, Steve Kenson. I've owned and run all previous versions of this as well too, and the first edition was a bit rocky. There were some mechanical bits that just felt a little weird in it. I honestly don't remember what they were because that game came out about 2006-ish, so it's about 11 years ago, and there's been a lot of other games since then. The second edition was a great improvement and is fairly close to what we've got in this version. But the 3rd edition is, I think, an even greater refinement. There's a bit of disagreement with that in the Mutants Masterminds community as to whether it was an improvement or not. But because there were certain things that it depends on how you want to see it, I guess. It either overcomplicated certain characteristics by breaking them up into smaller components, or it provided you more versatility for customizing your character. So I'm really like, it's the same thing we're talking about, but it's just the way that you choose to view that. The second parent is actually one of the previous attempts to make a DC Comics role-playing game. The first DC Comics role-playing game was published by a company called Mayfair. Mayfair had 3 editions of that game, and it used, they've given a name to the system for it, but I don't remember what I think it's Meg's Mayfair Exponential Gaming System, and it was a bit of an unusual beast in that the way the game worked was that every point you end up in your stat, like from 2 to 3, would be an exponential growth. So at 3 would be twice, would be the previous number squared. I think I'm trying to remember that. I think that's the way it worked. Maybe it was doubled. I don't actually remember now. I should have dug out my old DC Heroes stuff, because that was what that game was called, DC Heroes. The reason I mentioned that game, and I'm spending any time going into detail about it, is because one of the core designers on that was a guy named Ray Winninger. And Ray Winninger was I honestly don't know what he's working on right now, or in the last few years he's worked on. So forgive me if this gets back to Mr. Winninger. I don't mean any disrespect by that. I just don't know what his most recent projects have been. But I know that he was a big voice in the design at Mayfair. And the reason that's worth saying is because Ray Winninger is listed as a licensing consultant in this. So I think looking at this version of the game and being familiar with both the DC Heroes game and the previous versions of Mutants and Masterminds, I see this as both. I mean, Ray Winninger had gone through the licensing process, which involves a lot of jumping through hoops and, interpreting something that is not intended to be quantifiable, like comic books. Comic books, everything happens because of plot or because of story. It has nothing to do with set objective modifiers. So Ray had to go through that process of figuring out, is Superman's probably the strongest character in the DC Heroes universe, but who's stronger, Wonder Woman or Martian Manhunter or Shazam or Captain Marvel, or Captain Atom? So he had gone through that process and assigned those numbers for the catalog of DC characters before. So I think that's probably part of the reason he was brought on to help with that process. But also, I can see that there are elements in this version of Mutants and Masterminds that are definitely design cues taken from the Mayfair system, the MEGS system. One of the ways that one of the ways that I see that in this one is in MEGS, there used to be a sort of a way of doing shorthand math that would calculate like speed or velocity or distance or whatever, because you had different categories of different things, and it had been designed in such a way so that it was easy math to figure out, if I can lift X amount of things, how far can I throw them? Or if I can travel X amount of speed, how fast, how long will it take me to go somewhere? And it will translate into the game mechanics quite easily. That's been carried over into this game. That's the biggest change that I saw from the previous Mutants Masterminds game. There was also in the early 2000s, there was a role-playing game, a DC Adventures or a DC Comics role-playing game published by West End Games that used a lot of D6s. I am completely unfamiliar with that game, but everything I had heard about it was that it was not great. I mentioned that only for the sake of completeness, for the history of sort of DC's, the experience of DC in role-playing games, or DC Comics and role-playing games, not to disparage that game. I don't know enough about it to say one way or the other. And that's not what we're here. We're here to talk about what this game is. But it's interesting to see that those two previous games kind of intersected in this game. So this was published under license in 2010, and then basically every year afterwards, 2011, 12, and 13, there were additional books that were put out. I'm going to talk about those very briefly at the end of the video, but this was the first thing that came out for it. So what's this game about? Well, the game, not surprisingly, is about you playing DC superheroes. That is primarily the purpose of what this game is. The system is not keyed towards anything DC specific. Like, there is absolutely, apart from the characters that are included in here, where they're given stats by the rules for the game, there isn't anything in here that is inextricably linked to the DC property. You don't see like Kryptonian strength, or you don't see Owen, power ring, or anything like that. All the rules, all the everything that's in here, even the archetypes that are provided, the sort of default archetypes that are pre-generated for you to play with, all of those things have no DC elements to it as well. I imagine that was intentional, partly because they wanted people to be able to pick this up and run, the Marvel universe or the Image universe, or their own, thing, adapt for the Champions universe, or whatever they want to do, or their own thing. In addition to having it linked to a pretty strong comic book property. So let's talk about maybe the mechanics. Or I guess before I move on, like I said, there's a lot of information in here about playing in the DC universe, and there's some ideas for linking that to the DC universe, but there's nothing that is inextricably linked in the mechanics to that property. Which was, smart, because it was easy for them to just strip out the DC stuff and then slap some generic stuff in there and pump it out the door for those who didn't want to pay for who didn't want to have a DC book and wanted a generic book, or also for when the license expired. So let's talk about the core mechanics. Like I mentioned, this was a game that came from the Open Game license originally, or its first edition came from that. So it's a D20 game. All your task resolution, everything, you will be using a d20. A d20 is the only dice you will need for this, which is kind of nice. So when you're, when you're playing the game, you don't have to worry about having a mitt full of dice and a bunch of different varieties. You've got one thing that's going to resolve everything. That has both good and bad consequences to it. The d20 does not have any of the sort of moderating probability curve that comes from using, like, say, a 3d6, to get a result, or 2d10 to get a result. It's really just every number that is on that dice has just as much probability of coming up as anything else. That factor is sort of a deal breaker. The d20 is a deal breaker for some people, and there are other books that have come out subsequently that give you optional ways of modifying that. But in the core book, there's no options. It's just d20. It's assumed that that's what you're going to do. There's no alternatives for how to use different dice and how that affects the mechanics. It's also worth saying that in one of the supplements, the Game Master Guide, I think, that came out for Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition, they talk about why that's the case. And some of the design decisions that are in here for how, how you resolve matters, it is based on the idea that you're using a d20 and that every specific number is as likely to show up as any other one. So for that reason, just picking up and playing with 3d6 as your, or 3d6 plus 2, or I don't know, 46 minus 3, that might not give you the same, you may have some unintended consequences, but to be honest, I mean, it would be cutting both ways for your the players and for the NPC. So I don't know if that's necessarily going to, break the game. But in any event, I'm getting lost in the minutia of d20. So as I said, you're rolling a d20, and then what you're going to do is you're going to add, depending on what you're trying to do, you're adding either one of your attributes, or you're adding an attribute and a skill, or you're adding just your power level. All of your attributes, your powers, are just listed as a raw number. In previous editions, they had just like in other d20 games, you would start getting, a 10 was your attribute, you'd get no modifier, and then every 2 after that you'd get a +1. They've dealt away with the need for those first modifiers. All you're concerned with is your actual modifiers. So average human, I believe, run between 0 and 3. Actually, I think it's -2 to 3. And superhumans obviously go beyond that. The way that they track relative power in the game is through a mechanic called power level. Your power level functions kind of like what your character level does in other games, but the way that it controls that power level is by setting caps for what you can do, how powerful an energy blast you can have, how accurate of a kung fu punch you can have, how fast you can fly, stuff like that. It also, then the way, I guess, the other way that it controls that is at default, every power level gives you 10 points with which to build your character. So the default way of playing the game is you start off playing a power level 10 character. I'm sorry, it's 15 points per level, because starting off character starts with 150 points. And you spend 150 points to purchase everything: your attributes, your defenses, your powers, your advantages, which is sort of like what feats are, or edges in Savage Worlds, if you're more familiar with that. Feats are from, obviously, the D20 games. You also use that to purchase. I mean, it's through your advantages you do that, but you also purchase things like, if you want to have a bat cave, or you want to have a satellite headquarters or something like that, or you want to have a legion of contacts or a sidekick, you use your points to purchase that. So it's similar to other point buy superhero role-playing games like Champions, where you have a set sort of power levels. One of the neat ways this differs from some of those other games is because everything is using the same sort of just flat bonus, you have the opportunity to dial up one side of those of each of these sort of equations. So I'll discuss that first. So they set up, there are certain things that are like linked abilities. So those will include things like your accuracy with attacks and the damage you do with those attacks. those two things added together cannot exceed double your power level. So, for instance, with your starting character of 10, what that means is your attack cannot be higher than a 10, your damage cannot be higher than a 10. But what you can do is dial up one and dial down another one. So if you want to play a character who is more accurate but doesn't hit quite as hard, you could say, I'm going to move my attack limit to 14, and I'll dial down my damage limit to a 6. And that's done with the defenses as well, where some of your defenses are linked to the ability to be hit. So if you want to play a really fast and agile character who just doesn't take a hit very well, you can do that. Or if you want to play the real tough brick character who's easy to hit, like the Hulk or the Thing or something like that. I'm using Marvel characters as examples for this. I guess at the time of recording, the new Damage comic just came out. It came out on Thursday, so that character would be a good example. That's fresh in my mind because I saw it in Tony Daniel's Instagram feed. If you want to play a big, tough character who everyone can hit him, but it's really hard to hurt him or her, I guess, that's what you would do. And those kind of trade-offs make for a really interesting game that has a lot of variety. You can make a lot of different characters or types of characters with the same amount of points. It makes it really easy to fudge different concepts into relatively the same power level, and it gets around one of the problems I see with Champions. Champions is the superhero game that is published by Hero Games that uses their system to emulate superheroes. It's the oldest superhero game around. The problem with that game, as I see it, is that often what you end up with is that everyone's attack does the same amount. If you have a limit of 12d6 in it, everybody's attack does 12d6. Absent any other kind of modifiers, like things that make it more expensive, so you can only afford less dice. This game gets around that stuff. So the way that you determine whether you're successful with things is just like other D20 games, where you're going to make your roll against, if it's just a success or fail thing, it's going to be against a set target number. If you are in conflict with someone, then you are making a roll against them. And then if you want to know how well you affected something, like, say, a damage effect, or you wanted to mind control them, or you wanted to transform them or weaken them with your, like, a parasite type power. There you go. I'm back into DC references now, like the parasite and suck, the energy out of someone. What you do is you roll to see if you hit, and if you hit, then the target has to make a save. It's everything to resist attacks or deleterious effects comes from the target resisting it. So the saves, there's no hit points, there's no like fatigue points or anything like that. No stun, no body like in Champions. It's just a save. So your difficulty for that with attacks is a 15 plus whatever the power level of the attack is. So going back to our power level 10 example, if your attack is a 10, that means that someone who's hit by your attack makes a defensive roll or a save against a toughness save. Usually, if it's just a standard damaging attack, it would be against a 25. And depending on how they rolled against that, they'd add their toughness save. And then if they, depending on how far above or below they rolled, that would tell you how badly they were affected by it. And with anything that is not just a strictly damaging attack, it's generally classified as an affliction. That's including like mind control or poisons or transformations or things like that. And it is 10 plus the effect. And I think that the design decision behind that was because it affects or it targets different defenses, which may not be as high as your toughness. But I'm going to talk about that when I talk a little later about just the game in general, because that's one of the things that I find to be it's a bit of a problem. It's an easily fixed problem, but as written, I see it as a bit of a problem. The way that you determine how well you succeeded or how poorly you failed is basically every 5 points over or 5 points below gives you a different level of success or failure, and that will dictate what your results will be. So for instance, if you are hit with a just strictly damaging attack and you fail your save by between 0 and or 1 and 5, you will take there's one specific result, which is it's a hit, I think it's I can't remember what it's called. It's staggered or something like that. And what it does, it means that your next defensive roll using that particular defense will be one lower. So you going back to our PL10 basic standard plain Jane, guy again, that means his 10 defense would go down to a 9. And so forth. Then you kind of progressively go down. If you failed by more than 5, between 6 and 10, there's a more serious result. And if you failed by 11 to 15, it's an even worse result. And that's the way that it's interpreted for everything. Similarly, successes are interpreted the same way. Every 5 points over, what that means is that you're doing a lot of math for each round. There are DM screens that give you a sort of matrix that you can read on. You can check what the difficulty is. You can check what you rolled and find out what your result is, which is honestly a really great callback to the old 80s Marvel superheroes role-playing game published by TSR. But if you're not using those charts, then you got to do the math in your head. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too, because that can be a bit onerous because you're not dealing with often flat numbers. You're dealing with like, I rolled an 11 or I rolled a 7 and my thing is a 17. So then my total will be whatever. How much is that over the 22 that they have as a defense? Okay, there's that. Now they need to roll and add there. So it can be a bit of, it is certainly a math intensive game. If so I guess maybe I'll mention right now, like for younger players in particular, this is not a great, unless you want to spend a lot of time with kids practicing their arithmetic. Younger children will, I think, will be a little daunted by the amount of math that's in this game. So that's how the core mechanic works, and that's basically how everything is driven in this game. Everything is built around that idea of 5 over, is each stage of success, or 5 under is each stage of failure. So, excuse me. There's 2 other ways that the game allows you to sort of break the rules and mitigate the vagaries of the dice roll. One of them, or to go beyond what your capabilities are. One of those is extra effort, where you can do certain things like push your abilities beyond their limits or take another action or whatever. And that costs you 1 level of fatigue. There is also a concept called hero points. And hero points in this are they're just like action points in like older versions of D&D, or feat points from Iron Kingdoms, or bennies from Savage Worlds, but they're honestly even better. I mean, one of the main reasons is because you can do story intervention. It's a very kind of indie game idea where you can use your hero points to make small alterations to scenes. And that was the first time, because I am a latecomer to a lot of indie games, that may have been a much more developed concept in things like Fate or Burning Wheel, but that's not the world that I came from when I came to this game. And it was a real revelation. There's also a really great little bit of advice in this game that I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before, but it really encourages you to get the players to describe what things look like. And I see there being 2 reasons for them suggesting that. One of them is because these are superheroes. Like if you're playing a role-playing game, as for any part of the reason you're engaging with role-playing games is, wish fulfillment or like power fantasy stuff, you're going to want to, you're going to have thought about it and you want to describe what cool, badass superhero thing your character did. The other thing is that because the game involves a lot of math, I think that by forcing the players to do the narration of what they did, what it looks like, that forces them out of that math mindset, and it gets less of like just doing math to see how badly you hit Mongol or whatever, or Ra's al Ghul or whatever other villain you want to substitute in there. But it's a great bit of advice, and I honestly have I carried it forward on every other game that I've run since then. So that's quite helpful. One other thing I'll mention to you, and I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but they've got just like Pathfinder, and I think they did this in 3.5 and 3, where they started introducing the idea of conditions, and these were sort of they've carried over to 4th edition and to 5th edition D&D, and what they are is just basically shorthand ways of having little like crib notes of rules that you can just say that this is what's happening, and you can refer to that, and that's what the mechanics are for it. This is a much more substantive list of conditions than in 5th edition D&D for sure. And it's, I think, maybe on par with what you have in Pathfinder. But there's an awful lot. And there are also compound conditions. They don't call it that, but I can't remember offhand what it's called. And basically what they are is conditions which contain other conditions in them. And once you get familiar with them, or if you've got a really good cheat sheet to work from, and Green Ronin did have a really great cheat sheet that I would always make sure I printed out and handed to my players so they could look at it and see what each of those conditions did. But it means, you know, there can be a lot of looking up in the initial phases, in the initial time that you're playing this game. But it does provide a really great way of, you know, I mean, of a lot, giving you those variety of different things that you know, can happen as a result of the vast array of superpowers that you can have. One of the clever ways that they get around, it's, I guess one thing I should say as well about the core mechanic is that this is an effects-driven game. It is not concerned with how you do things. If you have an energy blast, it doesn't matter if it's a fire blast or a, you know, quantum blast, or if it's a radioactive blast or whatever. What matters is what it does. Does it damage them? Does it weaken them? Does it transform them? You know, does it give them cancer? Which would be a long-term debilitating effect, not just a straight damage thing. That's what you're concerned with in figuring out how to put mechanical bones to the idea you have for your character. It's very similar to Champions and to a lot of other, like Savage World Supers is like that as well too. You know, there are older superhero role-playing games where they did make a distinction, say, between like Flame Blast and like Eldritch Blast or whatever. This game doesn't make those. It decides that that is what happens at the table and in your narration. And if there is a mechanical effect that's going to come from that on a situational basis, that it trusts you in the DM to figure out what that's going to be. You know, you're not going to be able to set fire to drapes using your ice blast, but you certainly could with your flame blast. So it's a fairly loose game. Like once you've got your character built, the core, it's a very unobtrusive mechanic. There are still some wonky problems with it that I'll talk about a little later when I talk about who the game might be for. But it's a very streamlined game. So I'll give you an example of what a character sheet would look like here. So this is one of the sample characters in here. This is the construct. So this would be sort of like, let me get that there. There we go. This would be something like if you wanted to play the Vision, or if you wanted to play, I don't know, Red Tornado. There's a DC reference. That's everything you would need. That's all the mechanical stuff you would need to be able to play that character. It gives you all your stats, all your, you know, your defenses, all your powers. And this game also, one of the things you can do with your hero points, I can't remember. I'll say when I go through the book, I'll talk about the distinction between extra effort and hero points. But I've run this game since it came out in 2010. I still have a hard time remembering what the differences of what I can do with extra effort and what I can do with hero points, largely because one of the things you can do with hero points is spend it to ignore a condition that you're suffering from. You automatically recover. And most often what I have seen in play is players doing that to avoid the fatigue that you get from extra effort. So what you can do with those two things has sort of blurred together in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I do remember that is a hero point thing, I think it is, I'll check when we're going through the book, is that you can stunt a new power. And that's a problem that more, you know, fiddly bits or more crunchy mechanic driven games have struggled with before, where, you know, a character like Spider-Man, who in the comics does all sorts of weird things with his webbing, and it's all on a circumstantial or instantial kind of basis. It's hard in a role-playing game, or at least it has been hard to model how to do that. This gets around that. You spend a hero point, and I shouldn't say, so the Marvel superhero role-playing game did allow you to do that as well in this weird stunting thing. But it was, from what I remember, it was extraordinarily punishing to try to do that. And it was the likelihood of success was fairly low. So generally you didn't do it. This is really great because if you've got in particular what's called an array, a power array, where you pay for one power and it can be used to do a bunch of different things, like for instance, Green Lantern's ring. Green Lantern's ring can only do one thing really, really well at a time, or it can do a bunch of different things, but splits its powers between different things it's doing. That's what's built as an array. So characters such as, I don't know, like I keep going to fucking Marvel examples here. Let me try and think of, okay, so like Firestorm. Firestorm can do things like he can shoot concussive blasts, he can transform things at the molecular level. Um, I'm trying to think, I'm not sure there's other stuff. He can create objects as well too. So the way that his character would be built would be with an array, and he can use one of those things at a time. And you just switch points between those things. If you have an array like that, you can spend a hero point and stunt a power you've never done before. And it reflects Firestorm, you've got to try and do blah, blah, blah with this thing. I don't know, I've never done it before. Come on, just try. And then you spend your hero point, and now you've got this new power that you've never used before. Like, say, to do a teleportation. You affect things at the quantum level, Firestorm. Why don't you try and, travel through those quantum spaces? As long as your game master buys that, then you do it. I guess a less like bullshitty example might be if you've got ice powers, right? And you want to try and do something like, say you've got like blast, and you can create walls and you can create trapping things, but you've never, I don't know, like you've never just turned it to just cold, to just freeze someone and try and get them to freeze in place, or dampen their powers or whatever. That would be an example of doing that. That's one of my absolute favorite things with this. For 4-color superheroics, I think it's imperative to allow the players to be able to, who have those arrays, to be able to stunt those powers. If you're playing a character who's a super sorcerer or something like that, you want them to be able to do that. They still have to fit within the narrative confines of your power, right? Like, I mean, the DM has to give you the approval to do that. So it's not like, I've got cold powers, but I'm going to use my PowerPoint to now be able to, interlock or link my mind with a computer. You can't do, I mean, there's nothing in the rules that tell you can't do that. Apart from it says you got to get approval of the DM. So long as everyone's on board with that and they've got an idea of what they can and cannot do, that's fine. The problem you'll run into is if you've got characters who have really nebulously defined power sources, like super sorcerers, or people who have like quantum manipulation powers that are, it's popular in a lot of like 2000s comics. Anything that like Warren Ellis or Grant Morrison wrote, they've got characters who, their powers are restricted by plot, and that's it. If you have characters like that in your game, you're going to find that your players, you have a very hard time limiting what they can actually do. But anyway, so what do you play in this? Like I said, you're playing superheroes. You're going to use your the rules to construct your own character, or you could play the existing DC characters. There is only a limited amount of DC characters in here, but they're the big, it's the hits. They're playing the hits in this. And I'll go through who specifically is in here when I go through the books. But primarily, you're expected to make your own character. I mean, that's what I honestly don't know. Seeing the success of games like some of the Marvel games, and having run those games where people are playing existing characters, I have a different, for myself, I always would want to make my own character. I don't want to play Batman. I want to play my own character. But there's lots of people who want to do that. This game doesn't necessarily give you enough stuff to do that for very long. But we'll talk about that a little later. So what do you do in this? You play as a superhero. I mean, if you can think of what are the adventures in any ongoing comic book, that's what you're going to be playing. There's not a huge amount of advice for how to structure that, because it's not a hugely long book either. It's a 278-page book, which includes a really, really great glossary and some reference pages. So really the meat of the game is about 268 pages. And that includes a bunch of characters, some sample characters as well, and then the massive list of powers. So there's not an awful lot of discussion of how you structure a superhero game and how it differs from other types of role-playing games. There's some of it in there, but to be honest, if you've read comic books and you pay attention to what actually happens in the comic books, like that there are subplots with supporting characters and there are long-term, villains and things like that, then you'll figure out what to, what you're doing in this game. So let's turn to the book, and then we can that'll help flesh out some of these other things. So as I said, it is about a 268-page book. The first little bit is a bit of welcome to the DC, to the DC game, and throughout here there is tons of great art that is taken directly from the DC archives. Now, the time that this game came out, this came out in 2010. And as is often the case with superhero role-playing games, they sometimes fall victim to the passage of time, in the sense that the canon comics suddenly make dramatic changes to what's the status quo, leaving the role-playing games being more of a historical artifact than a reflection of what's currently going on. This game in particular was a very unfortunate, had very unfortunate timing, because either right before this came out or as this came out, DC decided to embark on what it called the New 52 project. And what that was to basically cancel every comic, and then relaunch every single comic in a new continuity. And I'm not going to talk about the success or the stumblings that they had with that, but what it meant is that the version of Superman that you saw in here, who had largely remained consistent since the 1985-86 mega series Crisis on Infinite Earths, where there had been a consistent, world for about 25 years, that world was suddenly swept aside. So the Superman who's in here is not the one that was in the comics on the stand at the time this came out. Neither was the Wonder Woman. The Batman was largely unchanged. So that, that remained, I think, partly because that character is a sort of a cash cow for DC. So, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Flash is different. The Green Arrow is dramatically different. Green Lantern is kind of the same. John Jones is incredibly, incredibly different. Hawkman is incredibly different. I'm just looking at the cover here. Aquaman's incredibly different. Black Canary was very different. And Captain Marvel isn't even called Captain Marvel anymore. So that's not to say that you can't use this for like New 52 characters. It's just that the version of the characters that are presented as canon in this book and in the supplemental books of the game line didn't reflect the reality of what was in the comics at the time. So the introduction is great. And to be honest, my preference is I like the New 52. I did pick up a lot of it. And I don't want to get into a big, thing about that. But one of the things that for me was always attractive about the DC universe was the sense of legacy and the sense of, legacy. There were different generations of heroes that sort of influenced each other, and there were successors, tons and tons of people who took up the mantle of whatever previous hero there were. I loved the Justice Society comic that came out in the 2000s that James Robinson and Jeff Johns wrote for a while. And so anyway, that's the world that you're inhabiting here, is the pre-New 52 stuff. So all the art, all the characters they're referring to, it's all from that period before the New 52. If you happen to be, someone who came into the comics and was particularly enamored of the vision of New 52, you're not going to find that in here. This will feel like an older version of the DC universe, but it will still be completely able and completely usable to create the versions of the characters that you are most familiar with. So some of the conditions, I mentioned that there's basic conditions and combined conditions. Basic conditions include things like defenseless, disabled, fatigued, hindered, immobile. And combined conditions are things like paralyzed, where you are both defenseless, immobilized, and physically stunned, or staggered, where you're both dazed and hindered. Extra effort. So this is the thing that causes you to get fatigued. What you can use that for is to get an extra action. You can get a bonus, so a +2 circumstance modifier to your next roll. You can boost one of your powers by 1 point. You can use power stunt. Okay, I was wrong. Power stunt comes from the extra effort, not from hero points. So apparently my familiarity with the game is even worse than I thought. You can get a bonus to your resistance rolls, things like that. Hero points are things like editing a scene. You can gain access to a feat for 1 round. And that's kind of neat. So like if you happen to be fighting a bunch of different minions, say, there's one advantage you can get. Remember, advantages are the same thing as feats in any other D20 game. You can gain access to, say, like the advantage that allows you to, once you take down one minion, you can carry on and take out a bunch, So that's cool. So you can really, if there's something that is it just so happens it's a really useful thing to have for that scene, you can use hero points to get that. You can get inspiration, which is the common sense rule that you see in some other role-playing games. You hand over a hero point and try and get a hint from the DM. And you can instant counter, instant recover. If the DM uses some bullshittery and your character is mind controlled by Gorilla Grodd, you can pitch over a hero point and say, "No, I'm not." So that's what you use hero points for. As I said, I really, really like the hero points. It's in particular the option to add new, get a new feat, use extra effort to get a new power, or to edit a scene. That gives players a lot more agency over the story of their superhero. And I think that's extremely appropriate for a four-color superhero game. The next section, it deals with creating characters, and it gives you the rules for between power level 1 and power level 20. That you could, in theory, play the game past that point. The game as written, the way that you advance is you are handed basically new PowerPoints. And once your PowerPoint total reaches the next tier, so for instance, to hit power level 11 is when you have 165 PowerPoints. That's when your the limitations will go up. So now it's 11, 11 attack, 11 defense, and then you can modify, or 11 attack, 11 damage, and you can modify the benchmarks accordingly. It's a great way of scaling up power level for the different types of characters, and still being able to, I guess it's a way of being able to model Superman and Robin, or like Darkseid and the Penguin in the same game. So I like that. It gives you some guidance on how to set power level for your characters. So if you want to play more like Justice Society or All-Star Squadron type, masked men with some powers or maybe no powers and just very capable combatants, characters like the Sandman, and I mean the original, not the Neil Gaiman character, I mean like Wesley Dodds, the Golden Age Sandman, or the Crimson Avenger, or Green Arrow, for that matter. You could set your power level down to 8. 10 is the default. 12 if you want to play big league characters, which are, they say, equivalent to the Justice League, but the Justice League power level kind of runs a pretty big range, or up to 14. And I'm going to talk at the end about how this game holds up at those power levels, but that's what it gives you the suggestions for. Then you also can pick complications. And complications are kind of like hindrances in Savage Worlds, or if I was more familiar with more indie games, I could probably name some of those as well. But it's ways that you get hero points fed back to you. A game I've played recently, Blood and Bone, has things called complications, which is just like this, actually. Huh. Look at that. Where you get the resources that you use to sort of alter the game as a player. You get those by having those complications played up. And those are things like, your motivation, like doing good, or acceptance, or greed, or other complications like your phobia, a power loss circumstance, a quirk, a relationship. If you've got a, say, intrepid reporter girlfriend / wife who routinely gets herself in trouble, that can be a way to have hero points fed back to you. Then gives you some advice on how to construct the character, like your origin. Here we go. So this is what the book looks like. It's in a very nicely readable font, and I love the blue on white colors. It's very slick and easy on the eyes. And then it gives you a ton of archetypes. And for point generation games, I find that these are extraordinarily useful, because you're not having to create the wheel, from scratch. Even if you don't want to play the archetypes as written, it gives you a starting point where then you can fudge around the rules. And one nice thing with all the different archetypes is that it gives you different options. So even though you're going to play, like, say, a battlesuit character, you still have other options to pick out of there. for which way it's going to be manifesting. Similarly, the construct that I mentioned as well, I use the example of some like robotic characters like the Vision or what's his name, Red Tornado. But the options are listed there include Elemental. So if you want to play kind of a Swamp Thing type character, a Undead Revenant, or even a Wraith. So the Revenant maybe would be like Ghost Rider, I guess, or Solomon Grundy. Wraith, I don't know what that would be. Maybe Ghost, the old Dark Horse character. But in any event, it's they give you great starting points, and they give you options to pick from there. Or you can use them to build your own character and start switching some points around or switching advantages around, because everything is built rules, are appropriate to the rules. The archetypes that are in the book include Battlesuit, Construct, Crime Fighter, which is like a Batman type, lots of gadgets and stuff, Energy Controller, Gadgeteer, Martial Artist, Mimic, Mystic, which is your Dr. Fate or Dr. Strange type character, Paragon, who's like a poor man Superman, Powerhouse, who's just a really super strong character, Psionic, Speedster, you think of the Flash, Shapeshifter, Warrior, which is, I think Warrior is, to be honest, when I think of what that character would be, I think of Hercules from the Marvel comics in particular, because Thor has way more other stuff going on with the storm powers and shit like that. But if you're playing a character who just is a really super strong character who's got, not necessarily flying, but he's got some capability with combat and maybe uses a big weapon, that's what a warrior is. Weapon Master is your like Green Arrow or Swordsman from Marvel Comics. So that's the characters you've got from there. And then again, you're completely free to switch them around. What I often do when I'm running this game for new players is I make them take an archetype first. And the reason is because the game's not 100% idiot-proof. So just like a lot of other point generation games, you can sometimes build suboptimal characters. So, I mean, the benchmarks provide a good way to sort of judge what you should, how much damage you should have, how much, what your to hit bonus should be. Like for instance, if you're playing a PL 10 character and your primary attack has a +6 to hit and it only has a 6 damage, that's 6 + 6 is 12, which means it's 8 shy of the total you could have with those two, which should tell you that one of those two things should be modified. So that's the archetypes, but again, you're not restricted by that. It gives you the example of 2 different characters being built, which is really great. The abilities or the characteristics that you have in this game are actually a departure from the standard D20 thing. So there's not just the 6, strength, dex, con, int, wisdom, charisma. What you have is strength, stamina. Stamina is your toughness or hardiness, agility, and dexterity. Agility is your ability to, sort of like what you would use for range attacks or things like that. Dexterity is your manual dexterity. Fighting is what you use for melee fighting. Intellect is how just raw smart you are. Awareness is like your perception stat. And presence is your like your charisma or your force of personality. Let's see here, what else? So that's the archetypes. You are also going to be selecting, or rather purchasing your defenses. Your defenses come with some default, like your characteristics, the ones I just listed off, they will determine the starting point of some of your defenses. And your defenses include dodge and parry, which are respectively used for ranged or melee attacks, fortitude, toughness, and will, which should be familiar to any other D20 players. They made the decision to break out the dodge and parry because, I guess, if you're a really great hand-to-hand fighter, but you're big and tough and slow, that you would have a good parry, but you have a shit, dodge. And they made a point also of breaking out strength and the accuracy. In this game, unlike in other D20 games, your strength does not give you both a bonus to hit in melee and a bonus to damage. Your strength, for the purpose of combat, only gives a bonus to damage. Your fighting is what gives you your bonus to hit. That is a really, really smart design decision. I know that they did that in Fantasy Age as well. The Dragon Age game that Green Ronin, same publisher, also put out They initially had it be the same, but they also broke it out into two. I like that a lot because there's a lot of times in D20 games where, you know, the giant, slow-moving hill giant is uncannily accurate with their giant club just because they've got this crazy bonus to their strength. You know, and that's just a weird bit of the game bumping up against the fiction that this game nicely gets around. I can't remember if they did that in the previous edition. I honestly don't remember because it's been quite a while ago. The game also relies fairly heavily on a it's not called a universal table, but that's what it used to be called in DC Heroes, the Mayfair game I mentioned earlier. But this is what this looks like. So what this is the same principle where you look at what your power level is, and it'll tell you, you know, what that corresponds to, depending on what it actually does. So, for instance, let's say I've got a power that affects a certain amount of stuff. That'll be like lifting things, or telekinesis, where I'm going to move things, or creating objects, where I'm going to create stuff. 12 in that tells me I can affect or create 100 tons worth of stuff. Similarly, if I've got that, you know, a movement power, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to look here. That will take me to the distance, which is 8 miles. Let me go back in here so I can show you. Okay, so now let's say that I want to figure out, so that tells me what I can do in one round. Come on, camera, focus here. Let's go. Come on, you little horse, run. Sorry, I need to lift it up. Come on, work with me. Anyway, well, it does not want to work with me. I apologize. One of the neat ways that this functions very much like what the old DC Adventures one did is, let's say I want to figure out how far I can fly in an hour. What I do is I look at what an hour is in here, which is a power level 9, and then I add that to whatever my power level is. Let's say I've got running, so I can move really fast, and I've got a power rank of 5. Well, how many miles per hour is that? I take 9, I add 5 to 14, and that tells me 60. I can run 60 miles an hour, and it carries over for a bunch of different things too. I have a super strength of 12, which tells me I can pick up 100 tons, and I can throw it 0 distance, which is equal to 30 feet. So if I have a strength of 12, I can pick up 100 tons worth of stuff and pitch it 30 feet. But let's say I pick up something like a 10-ton tank. How far can I throw that? 10 tons is about power level 9. Actually, it's below that, so it's power level 8, which means I got 4 extra, which means I can throw it 500 feet. And that's how you work out every bit of like distance calculation or weight calculation or time calculation in the game. It is awesome. It's something I thoroughly loved about the DC Heroes game, and is great about this as well. The levels go up, basically each power level up doubles the previous effect or the previous level. So, which makes me think that I'm remembering DC Heroes incorrectly, and that it was doubling, not squaring it. But yeah, so anyway, so that's the measurement table is what plays in for all of your powers and whatnot. And for a game where your characters can do such an incredibly vast array of different things, it makes it really handy to be able to judge things on the fly. Your players decide, you know what, I'm going to use my teleport to teleport my way to Chicago. How far, how long will that take me? You can figure that out, with a quick Google search. Anyway, and then what's next is it gives you some skills, and skills in DC Adventures are streamlined. So you only have a limited list, which is appropriate for a superhero game. You for the sake of brevity, it's not important to know 40 different skills that all happen to relate to being a thief, like a separate one for pickpocketing, a separate one for lock picking, for palming and whatnot. So the skills that are in here are acrobatics, athletics, close combat, deception, expertise, insight, intimidation, investigation, perception, persuasion, ranged combat, sleight of hand, stealth, technology, treatment, and vehicles. So, and each of those, basically anything you want to do that happens to involve any kind of training or expertise, it will fit in the lens of one of those skills. You also, if there are other things, like say you want to be a mystic scholar, or you want to know about the different dimensions or something like that, there is an advantage you can purchase to do that. The advantages, as I mentioned, are the kind of the feats But it's also the sort of, they're not quite all the way to powers, but it's some of them access smaller sort of abilities. Some of them are like the combat abilities are all just what you would expect from any other D20 game. There are things that allow you to hit harder, like power attack, or to be more accurate, like with accurate attack. But some of the other ones, such as the general advantages, are things like eidetic memory, where you can remember everything, or fearless, that you're immune to fear, or minions, you've got minions or a sidekick or something like that. So your advantages are one really great way that it fleshes out the options you have to sort of fine tune your character beyond just the combat stuff too. There are also two interesting feats that are sort of related, called Ritualist and Inventor. And what those are used is to emulate the sort of slapping together the ritual magic that we see Doctor Strange, or I'm sorry, I should use DC things, Doctor Occult or Doctor Fate or Zatanna use, where they're making spells up on the fly, but it takes longer to make them. Or similarly, for people to throw together gadgets. If you're reading a more high-tech Batman, like say Scott Snyder's Batman, where he is kind of a tech genius as well, you could have Batman cobble together some kind of thing. Or if you want to go Marvel, Reed Richards, Tony Stark, what they do, where they're slapping together some kind of one-use or one-scene use device that's going to do something that they're not otherwise capable of doing, like a psionic blocker or like a tectonic stabilizer or whatever, like whatever science comic bullshit you want to come up with. That's what those two feats allow you to do, is to access that kind of improvising opportunity. After that, it goes into the powers, and the power section is very extensive. The way that you build your powers is kind of like a framework, and then you take a framework for the power, and then you can add modifiers that are either positive or negative modifiers. Like, for instance, if your power does not work against certain things, like say the color yellow, or if it's more effective, like say it's armor piercing or whatever, you can add those modifiers to really tweak what your specific power does. And then you're able to calculate your cost. I'm not going to go through the full list of the powers that are in here, but to be honest, well, actually, here we go. Look at this. I've got a summary. So here's a list of all the different powers that are in here. And again, I want to emphasize too, because it is an effects-driven game, what it's concerned with is what your power actually does. Does your power restrain someone and prevent them from moving? Does it weaken their strength? Does it allow you to move through the air? Then that's what's important. That's what each of these powers tells you. And then you go from there by adding power modifiers to tweak it mechanically, and you add a narrative connection to it to describe what that does. Absent any other factors, a flame blast is built as an attack, or is it a blast? It's built as a blast. A concussive force, or an earth shock or something like that. It's all built the same way, unless you're adding different modifiers to make it do different things. There's also good rules for linking abilities too. If you've got a concussive earth thing that's a big gob of mud, so it hits the person and then actually restrains them as well, you build them separate powers and you link them so you can use them together. There is an enormous amount of flexibility in here, and the game doesn't necessarily have, apart from the samples I mentioned and the DC characters I'm going to go into afterwards, if you want to get a sense of the versatility that this system has, the Atomic Think Tank is the Green Ronin message board where they post the people posting their builds. There are thousands of builds on there, and there are certain threads as well. I honestly can't remember the names of them, but they're very easy to find, where you've got every conceivable comic book character you could think of, and even beyond that, has been converted to the system, by certain people. There's actually a guy named Jab, and his thread is called Jab's Builds. Jab's builds are all very good builds. He knows the system really well, and anything you could conceivably want is in there. He also does a good job of recognizing the role of certain things. As a DM, it is sometimes it's hard to distance yourself from the build to make sure that they are built as characters that are going to fall down to your heroes. it's sometimes more attractive to build a character as like, man, Lex Luthor is really smart and really clever. He's got this badass battle suit, so I'm gonna make him as effective as Superman, and you know, when really like Lex is there to get beaten by Superman, you know, in most stories, unless you've got some other thing that's going on. And his builds do a good job of that. The heroes are built as you can pick up and play them. The villains are there to, you know, to be punching bags in some cases. But he has a huge list of DC characters and a massive list of Marvel. Any Marvel character you could conceive of, however obscure, is probably found on that. And if not in his build, you can find other ones. The reason I mention that is because all of those people who are making all those builds have been able to create almost every single character you could conceive of. That's the versatility with this system. The way that I've heard people describe DC Adventures is that it does 95% of what Champions or Hero does, but in 5% of the time. I don't think that's accurate. I think that it does take a while to build a character in this if you're building it from scratch, but the versatility is correct. You've got an enormous amount of flexibility, and you can build precisely the character you want, only limited by the amount of powers you have. If you're playing in a campaign where you're playing masked heroes and you've got you're hell bent to be playing the Silver Surfer, you're going to be disappointed, but that's disappointed by the framework of the campaign, not because the system falls down on its ability to build what you're picturing. So then it talks a little bit about descriptors, and this is where it emphasizes the narrative aspect of the effect system, that it's very important. Even though it's effects driven, it means that it's important for you to figure out what kind of attack. If you just leave it as the bare stats, it's going to be boring and people won't picture it that way. That's why you need to describe it the way that, and the game doesn't tell you how to do that. It's your own creativity to describe what your attack is. Do I have an electro ray that comes from my battle suit, or is it a sonic blast, or is it a flame blast, or whatever, or heat rays? So anyway, the next section then is gadgets and gear, and the way that you get access to that as players is by taking advantages, which gives you a little budget to build your advantages or your gear, and it's the kind of thing you would expect, like battle suits or weapons or guns or swing lines or whatever. This is also where you build your utility belt, and a utility belt is built just like another kind of array, where it has one power, and then it's got a bunch of different modifications. So it's a way of making all the crap found in Batman's utility belt cheap and affordable. It also gives you the opportunity to use extra effort to find that thing, like the proverbial bat shark repellent that you have never mentioned or used. And that's great, because I think of actually some of the advice that came from the Blades in the Dark game, and it's very applicable here, where it's expected that your characters you're playing in this are badass superheroes. They would have thought forward, in particular if it's a character like Batman or a masked Avenger like that, they would have thought forward to the contingency. And you can spend a extra effort or a hero point and then get that thing that your character thought to hide in there, but that you didn't put on your list. So utility belts are handled really, really well in this. And there's a bunch of other stuff. There's some sample weapons, both ranged and melee. It gives you a little bit of high-tech stuff too, like alien ray guns and stuff, but it doesn't give you an awful lot of detail in that, because the game's not about that. It's not a sci-fi game where you need to have 10 or 15 different versions of laser rifles. It's just standard plain Jane things, because that's the way it is in the comics. There isn't a distinction made between a Daxamite laser and a Durlin laser. I'm trying to stick with DC references. You could say Kree or Skrull there as well. It then gives you sample vehicles and gives you rules for building vehicles. Vehicles are similarly very, very simple in this game. They have only a couple of stats, and that's nice, because again, like, it doesn't need to have a lot of stuff in it. The amount of times that vehicles are going to be the primary, the way that you interact with the rest of the world is going to be fairly minimal, so you don't need to have that much detail for them. Unless you're playing like an enemy ace, campaign. Next thing is building headquarters, and some really great rules in that. And then they give you some sample things for headquarters, like abandoned warehouse, or moon base, or underground lair, or urban fortress, or wizard's tower. And the rules that support those different headquarters is really great as well. There's also the opportunity to share points. If you're playing a team, and you want to have the Watchtower for the Justice League, or the Stark Mansion for the Avengers, or any of their other ones later on, Hydro Base from the late 80s. You got the rules to do that, and your characters can all contribute towards that budget. Then there's rules for building constructs, and then it gets into the actual rules and mechanics. And the rules section is, the combat and adventuring section is about 12 pages long. As I said, there's not a lot of rules in this because you don't need them. A lot of the stuff is going to be circumstantial or going to be expressions of your powers, so you don't have really involved rules for that. There are rules for social interaction, which are found in the Game Master section, but they're very similar to the rules that you've seen in other D20 games, where there is where you track what the NPC's reaction to you is, and that dictates what your difficulty is. Then it launches, as I said, into the Game Master section, where it gives you some advice on the mechanics and how to set difficulties for things. One of the things it really emphasizes that I also really love in this is say yes to your players. Because the rules support such a great level of improvisation, which is appropriate for 4-color superheroes, and because they're playing, power fantasy characters, they suggest just say yes. Say yes and roll with that in your story. And I think that's a great bit of advice. It also has some really good advice on things that are lost in translation between comic books and role-playing games. Those include things like the defeat and capture of villains, escaping villains, lethality, and loner heroes. Though those last two ones are particularly useful because there are certain players, if they're not coming from either a comic book background or not embracing the sort of ethos of 4-color heroes who don't kill, or if they're coming from, where their favorite character is the Punisher, or some, Rob Liefeld-esque character from the 90s, they're going to want to shoot the Joker in the face when they capture him and whatnot. And they give you some advice on that, and for managing the expectations for that too, and managing that in the campaign in general, and loner heroes too. One of the things that is tough for some players when they're building characters for this is they want to build their singular superhero when the game is a team, just like role playing is a team sport. The Justice League is a bit of a weird kludge together thing where, yeah, they've got the reason to get together because it's the most they're facing off against the most powerful threats, but each of those has their own title in theory, and each of them is off doing their own thing as well. Superman's got Metropolis to look after, Batman's got Gotham to look after. You compare that to, say, the Teen Titans, who have a very specific reason because they're all friends and they all live together in Titan's Tower, or to go into another universe, the X-Men, who are all students at the same school. That's some good advice because to suggest why loner heroes suck in this, because they're just, if you want to play, well, I mean, I guess like the answer to when people want to play like a Wolverine type character is that Wolverine is one of the biggest family people of any character. He's like Batman. Batman says he's a loner, but then he does nothing but adopt more kids and allow other people to become Bat whatever too. There's a terrific line from Grant Morrison's Death of Bruce Wayne? No. Death of Batman, maybe? Anyway, it was a series that came out after Final Crisis, and it said like the first truth of Batman is effectively that he asks for help. It's not that he's this dangerous, angry loner. It's that he wants help. He wants to bring people in. He lost a family in the worst tragedy that he experienced in his life, and he wants to spend the rest of his life building a family with a roster of Robins and whatnot. But anyway, that's what this gives you some advice on, as to how to tweak those character concepts that want to be loners back towards being team players. It then gives you some advice on creating characters and creating a series in general as well. And it gives you some sample frameworks to work from. And those include things like Legacy of the Bat. So like Batman died or went missing, and now you guys are the heroes who are taking care of Gotham. Or American All-Stars. This is set back during the Second World War, where you're a member of the All-Star Squadron. A League of Their Own. The Justice League has disbanded, and you're going to be the equivalent of like the 80s Justice League Detroit, or the kind of grab bag Justice League that was there before Grant Morrison relaunched Justice League, or JLA, in the late 90s. So you get to be your own kind of grab bag of weirdos. or Arena Alliance, and that's a really dated reference, but it's from a series called Countdown that came out in the aughts. That was a follow-up to Infinite Crisis that really just had characters coming from all different realities. And while I seem like I'm, my voice is rolling its eyes at that concept, one of the things I really, really love about DC is the idea of parallel worlds. That gives you so many great things to draw from and so many great places to throw characters. And I just love seeing permutations of different characters. Red Sun and the Elseworlds Tales, I just love those. And that's what that concept is. And I guess one other thing, I'm not sure if they expressly say it, but it would be a good opportunity for you to put your own spin on something. One of my favorite sessions I've run with this was a birthday session where I had all of my players play alternate versions of a Green Lantern. I set them sort of those who weren't familiar with who Green Lantern was, sent them the basics of it, and said, okay, tell me what your universe is like, and we'll figure out what lens this character fits in. And I had one guy brought me a Green Lantern who was from a world like Terry Pratchett's, fantasy novels. One guy played sort of sports-focused character from that world. One played a dinosaur guy, and one played someone who was from the Roman, from a world where the Roman Empire never fell. And those were the four characters they brought in from this. And they didn't, they did create those characters themselves, but they were through, a specific existing lens. So that would be a really cool way to do that arena thing, is to, the pan-dimensional League of Batman, or the pan-dimensional League of Superman, or whatever you want to do is great. And the setting material for this really supports that, because you get to have your cake and eat it too, where you're playing a recognizable known character, but you're not really playing them, and you've got your own unique spin on it. And then next, this is one of my favorite illustrations in the book. It's an awesome piece by George Perez from the Legion of Three Worlds miniseries. Then it gives you a little bit of information about the DC universe. Talks about ancient history and some of the high points of it, and they do a good job of hitting a lot of the things that make the DC universe distinct from, say, the Marvel universe, or the Image universe, the Dark Horse universe, or the Ultraverse, if those want to go back to the 90s. But again, this is from the version of the DC universe that existed in the before 2010, before the New 52 came out. I guess, so I'm just going to have an aside for a second here. There's an old from in 1985-86, when Crisis on Infinite Earths effectively ended definitively the previous DC universes and recreated it as one Earth afterwards. Alan Moore got to write a series of 2 issues which were called The Last Superman Story. And the intro to it had a little epigraph where it said, this is, and I may be paraphrasing this wrong, this is a make-believe story. Aren't they all? And I love that, and I use that as when I'm talking to my players about different versions of Superman or Batman or whatever. So even though you may be more familiar with or want to play in, the New 52 or some older version, or your own version of the DC universe, or even say, Zack Snyder's version of the DC universe, you can absolutely use these rules to do that. And while they give you, this game does give you descriptions of a version of the DC universe that is not recognized as the official version, who cares? You can easily adapt it to whatever you want. And a lot of the stuff, the broad strokes in there, Gotham is always going to be troubled by crime. It's always going to have Batman. The Wayne Tech is always going to be a main thing there, and so on. So then we go into a section that is heroes and villains, the brave and the bold, and the vile and villainous. And these are your sample characters. These characters include Aquaman. Let's see here. Aquaman, I'll go through the list here quickly. Aquaman, Batman, Black Canary, Captain Marvel, The Flash, Green Arrow, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, Nightwing, Plastic Man, because everyone's dying to play Plastic Man, Robin, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Zatanna. So absent the elongated man, you kind of have your 80s Justice League sort of set up there. And one of the neat things too is for a lot of characters, they give you little call outs. So if you want to play different versions of those characters. So for instance, if you want to play the Aquaman that Peter David wrote, where he lost his hand and he replaced it with a harpoon, he was really kind of, grew a beard and long hair and whatnot, they give you the stats for what that would be. If you want to play the more mystic version of Batman, or Batman of Aquaman, where he's got that water hand, they give you those stats as well. Or if you want to just play the more iconic version of Aquaman, you've got it right there. And each of the versions of these heroes that is in here is the iconic version. Many of these characters have been around since like 1938. Superman's from 1938, Batman's 1939. These characters are very, very old. They've had many different people describing who these people are, what they're doing, and what they're all about. This game does a really nice job of effectively summarizing what the last, say, like 25 or 30 years of that character have been. And then it gives you options to change that. You are, of course, also free to, because they show you what the math is for each of these, you can change them. And there's lots of folks on the on the Atomic Think Tank forum who do give their own versions. They don't feel that the Superman build is correct or whatever. Here's how I would build a Kryptonian. So while these can easily be used to run, as written, you're free to change those as well. Like, for instance, when I ran my Green Lantern thing, the Green Lantern in this one, I believe, is PL 14. Yeah, it's PL 14. For me, that was a little too high level, only because the math, it gets a little wonky. The closer you stay to PL 10, the more correct the results on the D20 will be. The more further you get away from that, either more power level, less power level, the worse it'll get. So I ended up creating PL10 versions of the characters, then we sort of tweaked them to fit everyone's concepts. But at the table, it played just like Green Lantern. It didn't make any difference. So while you could, use this, and I actually, in fact, did use this as a starting point, and then sort of dial back the power level to get to where I needed to be. That's what's useful there. Now, in terms of the vile and villainous, you have Black Adam, Black Manta, Brainiac, Catwoman, Cheetah, Circe, Darkseid, Gorilla Grodd, the Joker, Lex Luthor, Prometheus, Sinestro, Solomon Grundy, and Vandal Savage. So a good selection of different characters that are fairly iconic characters. Black Adam is probably the one that is the most popular in comics and comics alone and hasn't been seen in other media all that much. I should say as well that each of the characters has distinctive, great looking iconic art in there as well. This awesome Jim Lee piece of Superman. The art throughout this has been terrific. Great. Terry Dodson, Wonder Woman there, and so on. So after that, then what it does is it provides you some stats for, other supporting characters like civilians, bystander, reporter, a government agent, police chief, police officer, militant soldier, crime lord, and then a couple animals. And the animals list is quite limited. And then they give you a really helpful glossary, which repeats some of the information about the conditions from earlier in the book and other things. I mentioned the old Marvel superhero style chart. Well, there you go. That's what she looks like. So it'll tell you what your results are, based on, you can find what your difficulty is, what the number you rolled is, and you can color code what your results are. I have not used the chart, but that might actually save me some time, and I think maybe I'll do that next time. And then it just presents the chart again, the measurement chart. It also gives you some rules for changing sizes. Sometimes superhero role-playing games have problems with size manipulation powers, but this game does a good job of that. So that's what's in the book. It's in the core book. You've got a handful of DC, recognizable DC characters, both heroes and villains, and then some really robust character creation rules. So who is this for? This is what I'm going to end on. So as is probably apparent as I'm going through this thing, I really love this game and I've used it a lot. This has been one of my go-to superhero games for basically since it came out. I loved the previous editions of Mutants and Masterminds, and for me, this was an improvement of those ones. So every time it just gets better. I love the power rules allow players to build whatever the hell they want within reason, obviously, and you can feel confident that they're not going to be making broken characters. At least at first blush, it seems like that's the case. One thing that is noticeably absent from here that is in games with like a higher page count, I guess, and also that have a little bit more mileage under their tires, I guess, is that there isn't advice in here expressly for DMs to deal with problematic or like story breaking powers. Those powers are things like, well, let me give you an example of a character I had in my game. One of my players was really intent on playing a Martian Manhunter style character. And I thought at the time that it was because he really digged Martian Manhunter, who is this, he's got some really interesting character stuff to him. He's a Martian, so that's cool. The player was not interested in that stuff. What he wanted was the power set. And this is a player who comes from a very tactical background with Pathfinder. So the way he saw Martian Manhunter was, that's a character he's super strong, he can fly, he can read minds, he can turn intangible, he can turn invisible. So it's a character who effectively can be the very best burglar and almost, fight toe-to-toe with Superman, all in the span of a quick shifting of powers. I allowed him to build a character like that too, and it royally fucked my campaign because I had a real hard time challenging that character. There was only so many times I could. One of the ways I did that was I ended up making sure that he was having to chase after things. He wasn't just having to, defend things, because his character was just a fucking beast in combat. But there's no advice on that in here. And that would have been good. Just a little bit of information about, like, look, here's some pitfalls for this type of character generation. You need to be aware of what kind of game you're going to be playing to make sure create characters who are appropriate for that. The other thing is if you, in that same campaign, my other player was playing a Chaos Mage, which meant that pretty much anything that you could conceive of as a power is something he could use in the game. And that proved to be a problem very quickly as well, because there was nothing he couldn't do. He needed the hero points in order to knock off a spell for that. So that campaign became, I was having a hard time challenging either of those characters, and neither of the players built characters with a very robust backstory. So there wasn't even like NPCs or things that I could put in danger or something like that, where I could at least be, driving the story forward while I'm dealing with their, power problems. So that's one little bit of a problem I found with it. I mentioned earlier that the affliction rule. So the afflictions have a difficulty of 10 plus your roll versus 15 plus your roll for damage. There is a good design reason for that in the game, because it's not a lot of fun to have your character continually mind controlled. But if you've got a character who that's what your shtick is I'm going to mind control people, it makes it real tough to do that. Unless you're doing it to a chump, like a standard civilian or something like that, who you're going to be able to get a great result on them, then you're not going to be super effective. And I've seen that the fix for that most people have for that seems to be to just bump it up to 15. And because that cuts both for villains and heroes, there's no problem. That's an easy fix for that. But rules as written, I found that to be a bit of a problem. I also find that the save thing is a bit wonky. It's not, to me, it's not really intuitive. And it's hard to predict what's going to happen, because when you hit someone with your power, you could annihilate them on a bad roll, or you could, do nothing to them on a really good roll. And that's a bit, I mean, it fits, I guess, in the sort of in the comic or in the source material that it's trying to emulate, but it does make it a little swingy. So there's that. And if you come from a background where you're used to seeing a sort of a gradual decrease in your effectiveness, this game is something where on a bad roll, you could go from like, I'm in this fight to, ooh, I'm sleeping for a week. You do have a way of mitigating that in the sense of your hero points. So there is that there to avoid those weird swingy bits in the game, but it's there. Because you're using a D20 as well too. One thing I should mention as well, which I didn't, is that there are great rules for minions in this. So as appropriate, there's a different differentiation between like major characters who are, like Gorilla Grodd or your villains or your heroes who are going to respond and play by the same rules that your characters are. And then there are just faceless minions, the Joker's henchmen or the members of Hive who your heroes are going to plow through. That's great. And there are certain powers or certain advantages, I should say, that allow you to make those characters really shine in those circumstances. So if you want to play, for instance, a character who's a martial artist who can just, blow their way through a whole crowd of thugs, you can play that, and it feels that way at the table. But it doesn't also allow you to just knock down the big bad guy with one hit too. So that's great. The teamwork rules are good in this as well, and the way that they interact with the power level means that you can have, a power level opponent who, by virtue of how high the number is to affect them, you need to all work together to try and get that damage number up. And that's great. It's a really great way of, I think, or I should say just great. It's a really effective way of incentivizing the kind of thing you see in comic books or you see in the comic movies. Avengers 2, where Age of Ultron, where all the heroes are combining their beams together to blast Ultron and then have him fly apart. That's what's, mechanically in the game. It's because he's a PL 16 or 17 character, and all the heroes are around the range of between 10 and 12. So they need to work together to get a high enough number to be able to beat his defenses. And that's really cool. Players need to be aware that that's the mechanical game that's happening behind the scenes, but it definitely emulates the source material very, very well. This is also another aside too. If you want to, well, let's say who this is for. Let me get back on topic again. This is for someone who does not need to see the level of minute detail that goes into a power or a point generation superhero game like in Champions. I'm not picking on Champions here because I love that game as well. But remembering what the character sheet looks like for building a character in DC Adventures, here's what a character sheet looks like in Champions. Now, there is an advantage that comes from this because you do have the versatility to really tweak that character in all these little ways to make it exactly the way you want. There's never any question generally what you can and cannot do. And there's not the streamlined skill system in that too. So skill monkey characters get to look at a nice big fat list of skills. But if that's not what your thing is, if you're not interested in that and you don't need to have that level of detail, the adage that I mentioned earlier, 95% of what that can do, this can do, is absolutely true. I have yet to think of a character concept that I can't build in this, or have a character bring me a concept that I can't build in this. It's very easy to run this game on the fly. You don't need a lot of preparation. Your players will never know whether you've rolled your defenses or whatever else too. So it allows you to keep the momentum going. That bullshit roll of a 20 from some nameless thug when they manage to actually shoot the Flash, you don't have to worry about the Flash fudging their dice roll and going down, unless that's what you want to have happen in your story. It's very easy to once you are familiar with the way the different like the results function. It's a very, very fun game. It also fades, like this game in a lot of ways fades very much into the background as soon as you start playing, in particular if you're not in combat. The players will make really inventive and creative use of their powers that you did not anticipate, and the game gives you great ways of supporting them doing that. I got one player who was playing a Kryptonian. He wasn't Superman or anything like that. He was well, it doesn't really matter. It's war story stuff. But anyway, he was playing a Kryptonian character, And it always impressed me the things that he would use at the table. You know, like where there was a session where they got trapped back in time in an alternate history where the South was winning the Civil War, and they needed to search the White House, which was under Confederate occupation. And he was like, "I'm going to use my super speed and just race through and check all the rooms, and then race out again before anyone can see me." And I was like, "Yeah, sure, that's awesome. You know, like that's a great way. Give me a hero point and just did it." And I've seen so many times when players have done similar things, in particular with the Green Lantern. Uh, this game plays really well for those kind of four-color heroes who do lots of things. Another time I've run this game is there was an old Call of Cthulhu adventure called The Haunting, which has been in many, many versions of Call of Cthulhu as the first adventure you run. It is a haunted house thing where you go in and you're trying to discover why this place is haunted, and you search some records and you discover what the secret is behind that. Well, I took that and adapted it to be a haunted planet, and then just like changed some things. And I had my players play through as Green Lanterns. And that game, I've run that system or that adventure as Call of Cthulhu before, and it was way more fun as a Green Lantern than it ever was as a Call of Cthulhu game. And it was a ton of fun as a Call of Cthulhu one. The reason it was fun is because once the players became aware of the scope of things they could do with their powers, they went nuts and they kept coming up with these amazing, interesting ideas of implementing their powers, and that was great. And the system really supports that. What it doesn't do terribly well is characters of different power level. While you can create it, you can create those characters, playing them in the same campaign, playing Robin and Batman, you better have some players who are okay with playing characters who will function differently mechanically at the table. Now, that's not something unique to DC Adventures. That is a problem with pretty much every superhero role-playing game other than the Margaret Weis Marvel game. That game cracked the code for how to have Thor and Kitty Pryde in the same game. It's a totally different animal than what this game is. And it's a more narrative thing. So like that's a discussion for another time, but that is one thing. Is while you can create those different power level characters, they won't necessarily, they're not going to play the same, you know. So at the table, you will have the same, if say you want to play the Justice League, you will have the same problem that every writer of Justice League has, which is, what the hell do I do with Superman? I got to come up with something to keep him occupied so that everyone else can do things in this game without him just solving things, you know, every problem. But yeah, so I guess if you are a DC fan, obviously this is a terrific game. What's come out since then, since the core book, they released, whoopsies, two Heroes and Villains, two volumes of Hero and Villains. And what this does is it gives stats for all, or not all, but a massive amount of different DC characters, ranging from the very, very iconic, like the Penguin, to very obscure, like Plastique. It's great. The power levels all seem to sync with each other, so it's clear that they had some thought as to where everyone was going to fit in the scheme of things. So if you did want to use the characters from the core book or some of the characters from here, it will model properly. So like Brainiac will be a suitable challenge for Superman. Lex Luthor will be a suitable challenge for Superman, and so forth. And then if you want to modify the characters, it's pretty easy to just dial down the power level. So if you want your PL10 characters to fight Mongol, you can do that. You don't need to go with the stats that are in here. The final release they had for it was the DC Universe guide. And this is sort of the, it's the guide to the universe. It's the atlas for the DC setting. And it includes a ton of other new characters in here as well, and tons of great ideas for, you know, what to do with your stories and your games. It again is about a world that at the time this thing came out in 2013, and this particular setting was no longer the canon DC world, nor had it been for 3 years. But because there's been so many different iterations of DC, you know, all of this material probably could be very easily modified. And to be honest, I mean, like, it's still great reading. It gives you great ideas for things. For instance, we had a character where a player of mine who loves Green Lantern. Green Lantern is his favorite superhero. We were trying to come up with a different, like a non-North American focused character. and we were thinking of using a Latin American country, but at the time we were struggling trying to figure out a place that would be politically appropriate, because at the time, a lot of the places that would have been really scary and dangerous and whatnot, it just wasn't, the geopolitical situation had changed. But when I was going through here, I was reminded that there are a number of fictional DC countries in South America, and we were sort of like, well, fuck, well, let's use that. Like San Marco, I think was the one we used, and said, fine, your character is a human rights activist from San Marco who is a fearless guy and gets the Green Lantern ring, and then we go from there. And so yeah, so there's tons of great stuff in here too. Plus, if you are a DC Comics nerd, there's so many great things in here that you may have forgotten about, or when you see them, you're like, oh my god, I got to use that in a game. I have in particular used the Martian or the Manhunter androids. For whatever reason, I just adore those characters. And if you are not familiar with who they are, let me go to my quick guide here. But they are sort of in the DC universe, or one version of it, they were the predecessors to the Green Lantern Corps. The Guardians of the Universe put together these crazy androids to go out, and it turned out that they didn't have a lot of empathy. Because what robot would have empathy in the 60s when these were created? So they turned, and then they tried to revolt against the Guardians, and then the Guardians erased them or depowered them all, sent them off, and then created the Green Lantern Corps. But they didn't tell the Green Lantern Corps about it. This is what a Manhunter looks like, and I just love them. They are a really great adversary. You can use them as just brute force things, as raw alien conquerors. You can use them as secretive infiltrators who have set up secret societies on different worlds that have perverted the beliefs, or so people think they're doing something good, but it's actually something bad. So anyway, so in summary, yeah, I mean, DC Adventures, I think, would appeal to anybody who wants a moderate crunch, but very easy playing game. Like I shouldn't say it, the math component is a bit of a challenge, but you've got that color-coded chart you can use to speed things up. So if you're using that, that would make things a lot faster. But most of the hard work or heavy lifting, is done at the character creation stage. One other problem I should mention is advancement. So one thing you can't get around in this is that if you do want to see your characters advance, if you want to reward your players, you give them PowerPoints, and those can be spent just like they are in character creation to increase their powers, to learn new powers and whatever. The problem is you have to decide whether you're going to keep them at the same power level and allow those PowerPoints to be spent to diversify their powers, or whether you want to keep letting them get more powerful and go up in power level. That's a problem in a lot of games as well, a lot of superhero role-playing games. And the only one that I have seen so far that gets around that, and if I'm wrong about this and there are other games that do a good job of it, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to check it out, is the most recent Savage Worlds Superpowers companion, because the points you use to buy and build your powers is different from the advancement of your character. So your character can keep advancing, and you're, as a player, you're able to keep theory crafting your character and picking new cool things for them, but it doesn't make your character progressively just more powerful in a raw power kind of sense. And that's what happens in this. I have used in the past where I've restricted the players so that the 30 points, I double the amount that they have to gain before they go up on power level. But I found with that, what ends up happening is sometimes they just hoard their points. They wait until they finally hit the next power level, and they dump all those points they've saved up to boost their attack, boost their damage to the new appropriate benchmarks. So that's a relatively minor problem, and to be honest, like if you're using it for one-shots or for short campaigns, that will never be a problem for you. If you are planning on doing, what like some people do with, say, Champions, where they play for years and years and years with the same characters, you will run into a problem with this game, because your characters will go from moderately leveled, 4-color characters to, Heralds of Galactus or demigods of some kind. So So yeah, so that's the only other caveat. I don't want to end on a negative note. On a positive note, this is one of my, if not my favorite superhero game. Right now, I'm really enamored of the Savage Worlds Superpowers Companion, but this is an amazing game. Like this is, I love using this to run pickup games. In particular, if you have players who make, who really love certain characters. This was before the Suicide Squad film came out, but I had one player who loved playing sort of morally ambiguous characters. So he asked if I would run a Suicide Squad adventure for him. So we got a bunch of other people together and we played that, and it was so much fun. We had someone playing Captain Boomerang. We had someone playing King Shark. We had someone playing, gosh, I don't even remember who else was in there. I don't even remember right. Oh, someone played Bizarro, and he role played Bizarro so fucking well. So yeah, and that was just great. And we used the stats right out of the book too. We didn't bother to try and fudge them or whatever. So if what you want is a game that, first off, you want to play DC characters, awesome game for that. If you want to build characters to play in the DC universe, fantastic game for that as well. If you want to build characters to play in another universe, the Marvel universe, your own, whatever, again, fantastic game for that as well, subject to the little concerns that I had as well. So I think that there is a reason why Mutants and Masterminds has kind of been the juggernaut in the superhero role-playing game, sort of field for such a long time, is because it's just a really good game. This is a iteration of that previous game that has seen nothing but refinements and improvements over each edition. And one thing I'll mention as well too is the very expansive third edition Mutants and Masterminds game line is completely compatible with this. The one product that wasn't published for the DC Adventures line that I still really wish they had actually cranked out was a DM screen. They didn't do a screen for it. So there is one for Mutants and Masterminds that's a really great screen. It's got perfect information on it, everything you would ever need, including all the complications and stuff like that, or conditions, I should say. So yeah, so that's DC Adventures. As always, if you have any comments, concerns, or questions about the game or my review or anything like that, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will endeavor to respond in a timely fashion. I should mention as well too that I am going to try and sort out how to have a live chat feature on these as well too, so that I can respond if people want to ask questions as I'm going through this. I can respond in more of a timely manner rather than waiting for people to go through and then post comments below. So in future video reviews, I'm hoping to be able to have that. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review, and more importantly, I hope it has helped you decide whether DC Adventures is going to be, or Mutants and Masterminds 3rd Edition is the right superhero role-playing game for you. And I will see you folks again in 2 weeks with the next review. Thank you. See ya.